Hey, Arman here, and what I want to cover in this video is basic nutrition of low versus high carb, because both of these nutrition strategies do work, and I've done them both, and I've done them both very extensively, so I'm just going to highlight some of the key differences. So with the two different approaches, when you're talking about high carb, you're going to be talking about taking in 50% or more of your macronutrients, which is protein, fats, and carbohydrates. So 50% of the macronutrients you're going to have will be from carbohydrates, and that'll be from different sources, obviously, sugars and carbs combined. So when you're looking at low carb, the definition of this is 10 to 30% is considered low carb. I got to tell you though, I mean, that's the definition it is, but I disagree. 10% or less is what's considered low carb. As far as I'm concerned, I mean, 30% carbohydrates is that's a lot more carbohydrates than most people need. So with the two differences, high carb, you're going to have to eat typically for developing muscle or for energy. They recommend you having 5 and 6 meals a day. So I've done this, and so one thing I will say, for me, it's not sustainable, and probably not going to be sustainable for you. So that's one thing to consider when you're going to be going high carb, because you got to eat low fat, and I'll talk more about that. But so that's one issue with high carb. And then when we're talking about eating low fat, the reason you have to eat low fat is because every time you take in carbohydrates, typically 5 grams or more, you have insulin that has to come up to process the carbohydrates. And so that insulin gets in there and does that. And so what happens with insulin though, is if you have too many carbohydrates, the insulin has to store them somewhere. So if the muscles in the liver are already full of glycogen from storing, putting carbohydrates in there, there's no place for them to go. So now it has to convert them and put them into the fat cells. And this is why you see people who eat a lot of carbohydrates and a high carbohydrate diet tend to get heavier, because insulin is a fat storage hormone. And so when insulin's elevated and doing all this, you do not burn fat. It's just not going to happen. And that's why you have to eat low fat. And when you're eating the sugars and carbs, that's quick energy, so that's great. But again, that's going to mean typically you got to eat more often to keep your energy levels up. So I'm not a real big fan of the high carb. And again, I did it for 20 some years, maybe a little bit more than that. And so one of the other things I found out when you eat carbohydrates with protein fats is you get a lot of bloating. And the reason for the bloating is the carbohydrates are alkaline in nature and protein and fats are acidic in nature. So when they mix, that causes a gas, and that's going to cause you to have bloating. I used to have like 5, 6 eggs in the morning and a bowl of oatmeal, and every time I got done eating that, I was bloated for quite a while until that kind of cleared out, thinking, well, that's a healthy breakfast. I got a lot of fiber in it, and I got the carbohydrates. But I didn't really feel that good on it, for one. And so that was something I didn't really enjoy. And then you're eating the carbohydrates throughout the day, got insulin elevated the whole time. So I was finding myself having to constantly fight on, keeping the carbohydrates down, so I keep my, body fat down, because I like to maintain my abdominals. So that's one of the harder lessons for that. Now, when you're going to low carb, typically 10%, or like what I recommend is 30 grams or less per day, which is really low. What happens here is you keep insulin down and out of the way. So what that means is you're less likely to have fat storage from your caloric intake, because you're just eating protein and fats. And protein and fats, again, are acidic in nature, so they digest well. And that's really important to make sure you're absorbing your protein efficiently. So you'll also learn that when you do a lower carb diet, you actually take in less calories, because you fill up pretty quick with protein and fats. They tend to have a better effect on your hunger hormones like leptin and ghrelin. So that's another cool thing about going low carb. And the negative is you can't have carbohydrates all the time. But this is where I have my hybrid program, which is in another video, where I talk about carb cycling, where you do low carb for a period of time, and then you do high carb, you reload the muscles and liver with carbohydrates. But I want to highlight the differences here, because you'll see these in the media, and there's a lot of mechanics going on with this. And so one other thing that's a negative is just staying low carb all the time, when they call it keto and these carnivore and things like that, it can affect your gut microbiome, which isn't healthy for you either. So that's not a positive, because you're missing some nutrients or taking them out of your diet that you should have. And that's why I like carb cycling, because I can put those nutrients back in. So one other thing that can happen from doing a higher carb diet is you've got insulin floating all the time. So you don't burn any fat, and so this insulin's staying up. And so if you're having 5 and 6 meals or even 4 meals a day to keep your energy up, and this insulin's staying up, what can happen over time is insulin resistance. Your body is constantly dealing with an overload of this, the insulin being elevated. And insulin elevated for a long period of time is toxic to the body. Your body can only handle so much of that. So that's one of the bigger problems. So what they found with insulin resistance, it leads to excess body fat, because you can't process the carbohydrates in the muscles and liver anymore, so it has to go to the fat cells. Leads to cardiovascular disease much quicker, and also leads to diabetes. So that's just some quick ones that insulin resistance is a factor for. So you got to keep that in mind when you're doing your nutrition, what's going to be a better fit for you long term. All right, so that's a wrap on the basic nutrition. Hopefully it wasn't too confusing for you. Hope you got a good takeaway. Other than that, we'll talk to you again on the next video. Take care.